Here are 51 facts about prisons they don't want you to know, and you definitely didn't know most of them. In 2018, about 6.41 million Americans were either serving probation, released on parole, or in jail. Worldwide, there are 144 people in jail for every 100,000 citizens. In the US, that number is much higher at 655. After the 2.3 million people locked up in America, China comes next with over 1.65 million. Then Russia follows with 874,000 and 161 people in prison, followed by Brazil and India with 371,482 and 332,112 respectively. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, it costs over $80 billion each year to keep the US correction system running. However, many people believe this is way less than what it actually costs. In 2017, for every 100,000 black men living in the US, about 2,336 were sent to prison. In prison, inmates do jobs like food service and laundry, but they get paid very little for their work. Studies have found that they make between 86 cents to $3.45 a day, which is barely enough for a few phone calls. About half of all the people in prison in America have full-time jobs while they're there. This means at least 870,000 inmates are working 40 hours a week. If you come from the bottom 10% by family wealth in any nation, your chances of going to prison are 20 times higher compared to those from wealthier families. In the US, there are about 7.3 million jail admissions in only 1 year. Big companies make a lot of money from the prison system, so they want it to keep running. These companies also give money to many politicians, both nationally and in different states. Some states even have contracts with private prisons, promising that they'll keep them at least 90% full. Chamoy Tepiazo, who deceived thousands with a Ponzi scheme, was sentenced to 141,078 years behind bars. This is the longest prison sentence in history, and it's even included in the Guinness Book of World Records. For a long time, prisoners have been used for medical experiments, and this is still happening today. The number of women being sent to prison has increased by 400% since the 1980s. However, overall, only 7% of all inmates are women, while the rest, 93%, are men. The 13th Amendment has a big hole in it. It says, slavery or forced labor is not allowed, except as a punishment for a crime someone has been found guilty of. This except has made life worse for millions of people. In some prisons in Brazil, inmates can shorten their sentences by reading books and writing reports. For every book they read and report they write, they can reduce their sentence by 4 days, up to a total of 48 days per year. In 1995, a 17-year-old Sarah Jacimi Cruzan got a life in prison with no chance of parole sentence for killing her pimp. However, she was eventually released from prison and forgiven for the crime, and she ended up as an American activist. It's no surprise that people in jail have a lot of free time, and that's when they often come up with great ideas. Some inmates have even started big businesses while they're locked up, like making and selling medicines, creating art, or even coming up with new recipes. A man got 12 years in jail for killing and eating the last Indo-Chinese tiger in China. In Mexico, it's considered legal to escape from prison because the law acknowledges that everyone wants to be free. One concerning fact about life in prison is that the first 72 hours after being locked up is when inmates are at the highest risk of dying for any reason. At Decatur Correctional Center in Decatur, Illinois, female inmates can have their babies with them in prison for up to 2 years. These mothers have a 0% rate of going back to prison, which is much lower than the statewide average of 51.3%. The Netherlands is shutting down prisons because there aren't enough people to put in them. To help inmates turn away from crime or start fresh after their time in prison, many prisons in developed and developing countries let them study online or attend school while they're behind bars. Wealthy people in China have and pay body doubles to serve their prison time for them. Private prisons have figured out that giving inmates cable TV is cheaper than hiring more guards to keep them calm and under control. In America, companies can hire prisoners to work in call centers. The prisoners get paid 92 cents per hour to take these calls. The United Nations has rules on how to treat prisoners, called the Nelson Mandela Rules. They say that prisoners shouldn't be treated like slaves and should get a fair wage and good working conditions. Even though these rules exist, many countries still break them. In 2016, about 560,000 prisoners were forced to work for private people or groups, according to the anti-slavery organization Alliance 8.7. According to a report from the US government, China has a bunch of prisons where inmates are made to work, making things like Christmas decorations and shoes, which are then sold overseas. In North Korea, where about 200,000 people are locked up in prison camps, prisoners have been told to dig holes where they'll be buried, as reported by Amnesty International, a human rights group. Big companies like IBM, JCPenney, and Victoria's Secret have been found to use prisoners to do work for them. From 1987 to 2007, 2007, the number of people in prisons in the United States tripled. People in prison who have mental illness are estimated to be 1.5 to 5 times more likely to break the rules compared to those without mental illness. For inmates who are into music, they can keep making music even while in jail. Rappers like Tupac, Mac Dre, and Young Thug have released albums while locked up. With permission and the right setup, they can make music and even have concerts in prison. The development and worsening of mental health issues in prison are closely linked to factors like overcrowding, not enough mental health services, lack of privacy, higher chances of being a victim of violence, and being put in solitary confinement, which can lead to self-harm. The USA have consistently been among the top 5 countries with the most executions each year, usually coming after China, Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. Sometimes prisoners can have pets if the prison allows it. Clubs exist in prisons. It might be surprising, but inmates can actually be chosen as parish pastors, head of clubs, etc. If your fiance gets locked up, don't worry, you can still get married in prison, and you have the right to spend time together as a married couple, except in federal US prisons. More and more prisons are using ankle monitors instead of keeping people locked up. It used to seem like something out of a sci-fi movie, but now it's real and happening in lots of prisons across America. Nowadays, lots of prisons are giving inmates tablets and allowing them to send emails. This makes it easier for them to stay in touch with their family, friends, and others. The food in prisons isn't great. Some meals are barely edible, especially in private prisons where they try to spend as little money as possible on food. In some US states, there are 3-strike laws, where if someone's found guilty of 3 serious crimes, they automatically get a life sentence in prison. According to the World Prison Brief database, the Central African Republic has the lowest number of people in prison compared to its population. Only 16 out of every 100,000 people are in jail there. If someone is serving a life sentence, they might be able to get out after a certain number of years, unless they're sentenced to life in prison without any chance of parole. The time they have to wait before they can ask to be released varies from state to state. In some states, it's as short as 15 years, but in others, it can be as long as 50 years. Research shows that people who committed violent crimes are actually the least likely to commit another crime after they're released. But even if someone serving a life sentence becomes eligible for parole, they're hardly ever let go the first time they ask. And in some places, they're never released at all. During parole hearings, inmates don't have legal rights. The courts see them as having no protection. According to international human rights law, it's not allowed to give the death penalty to someone who committed a crime when they were under 18 years old. But some countries still put young people in prison and even execute them for their crimes. In some prisons, they set up places for people to pray, like churches or mosques, and sometimes they even hold religious events or outreach programs for the inmates. A survey in 2004 to 2005 found that there are over 3 times as many people with serious mental illnesses in jails and prisons as there are in hospitals. Among young adults in state prisons, about 63% have a mental health issue, while only around 40% of older adults, age 55 or above, have similar problems.